Welcome to the polling station. We have an absolutely packed show today. Ron DeSantis has just announced that he is going to, via, predictably enough, Elon Musk's Twitter, put his hat in the proverbial ring to take on Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and everyone else in the US presidency race. But we also have mad stuff closer to home. We have the Suella Braverman farce. We have really alarming poll figures for the SNP. And we also have, obviously, the fallout from the Northern Ireland election, which we covered at length last week. Let's go over to Paul Krishnamurti, who is in Rhodes in Greece. Paul, it looks warm over there.
It is warm. It's okay. Yeah, can't wait to get out. Big news, right, in America. Not surprising on any level that DeSantis is running, and I see that there's already been a gamble on Betfair. He's coming from 7 to 6 this morning, which is standard. That seems to happen every time somebody declares, like happened with Nikki Haley on half, and then they might go back out. To be honest, the odds are very short, considering he is 30% behind Trump in latest polls, and I think that the Trump machine has landed quite a few blows on him in the last month or so, and it's quite notable to see, they're warring on social media. But at the same time, if Trump falls in a hole because of his legal problems, I'll get to that, then DeSantis would be the runaway favourite. And I see from last night's news in the Wall Street Journal that it does appear that he's going to be charged with illegally taking classified documents and obstructing their return, some kind of charges on that. And that appears to be imminent. Likewise, in Georgia, Fannie Willis has the DA there has set a timeline of, I think, early August for charging. So it looks like he's going to have the hat trick of indictments within the next 6-7 weeks. So I would say on that front, DeSantis probably isn't in a bad position.
The one thing, and it's kind of just an extension, really, William, of what Paul is saying there. It sort of looks, after the last sort of few years, it sort of looks very hard for Donald Trump to beat Joe Biden in a runoff. It doesn't really make sense that he should, after the polling losses that he's had and so on and so forth. So DeSantis is now into 5-1 on Star Sports. You can make a case for this, but I think what Paul is saying is right. It probably does look, given the MAGA movements and Trump's kind of hold over the GOP, it probably does look like he will have to fall into some sort of jail, effectively, or some sort of criminal issue for DeSantis to get the nod.
Yeah, I think it's looking like that. DeSantis, I do think, has some things in his favor, namely the fact that big GOP media donor classes, if they don't like Trump, if they think Trump's got too far gone, etc., and they want to try and take the party back, he's a more palatable alternative to them, right? He could get the endorsements of, say, like Wall Street Journal types, legacy conservative media organizations, and he can get a platform. If I can make an observation just from watching him, his stickiness, his sort of lack of let's say retail politics would worry me a little bit.
Well, he's no charisma whatsoever. He's no charisma.
A more direct way of putting it, yeah. Trump definitely has more of a connection with the modern GOP guy than DeSantis does. And there's also the problem that DeSantis is caught in this catch-22, where Trump and his endorsement and Trumpism propelled him to the Florida governorship. But he is going to have to end up running against that in some form, in some way, one thinks, to try and take nomination. Now, his transformation into this sort of really radical right, anti-woke, culture warrior is a relatively recent one. He plays that role well. The only issue is when you're up against a guy who sort of turned the GOP that way, you can look like an imitator. And all this stuff, like this branding, this retail politics, it matters a lot in presidential elections, especially when you're running in the caucuses, especially with the modern GOP. So I think he's got a lot of work to do to cut into that gap. But just the fact that he's running just the fact that he's visible, just the fact that he can become a realistic alternative to Trump, so the lesser of two evils for maybe senior GOP people, I think makes him a serious and realistic contender. I think it's very much on. The key issue for me, I think, will be three things. First of all, what do Trump's legal troubles look like in a few months from now? Because as Paul has written and talked about very eloquently, as much as the New York case took all the headlines, the other stuff is far more serious. And that's going to be much, much harder to bat away, even with the control he has over the GOP. And then secondly, also, when DeSantis gets going, is he going to eat into a gap? Is the Trump lead a little shallow? Or is it the case that actually, no, this is the hardening of the GOP and nobody can touch him, in which case it could look futile?
I don't think it is, Paul, because I feel, first of all, I don't feel Joe Biden has an unassailable lead over whatever runs if it isn't Trump. And second of all, I think Trump has kind of lost his way and will further lose his way. But does this mean that DeSantis has to roll back from the sort of the anti-woke stuff and all of that William refers to? I think that, to borrow his own word, I think that might be shallow enough. If DeSantis just puts himself forward as a candidate of reason, center ground, obviously right, but center ground, who's just an alternative to Biden that people can vote for, maybe he does need to change his strategy a little, because he's not going to get elected as Trump light.
Oh no, I think he would. I think there is no such thing as moderate conservatism. It's dead.
Relatively
Those
moderate.
people, well, even centre ground, you know, like just the word woke is catnip now to the right. You've only got to look at how many articles now include that in the SEO. They're obsessed with it. And to be fair, like, it may disgust me, but you can't argue with how successful DeSantis has been in Florida by doing that, right? I think that the bigger threat, and I also think that Joe Biden's in a lot of trouble, because I think that we could be on the verge of a catastrophe that we've never seen before, which is the US default, because they are trying to crash the dollar, as I've said for years. Right? And this is not just a political stunt. I think the bigger threat to Trump and DeSantis, I agree with you, Trump is just doesn't have the cut through he used to have. I mean, his CNN town hall got 3 million viewers, which is a lot for CNN, but it's not a lot in comparison to where he was. And it's also really noticeable to see some of the Trump outriders on social media who were so influential in the past, like, say, Bill Mitchell would be an example, right? They are all firmly in the DeSantis camp now. Also, I mean, just the fact that he has Elon Musk by his side at the launch tonight, that speaks volumes about
how significant is that, actually?
Well, I mean, the guy now owns the public commons, right? And Elon Musk is the one tied into the vast foreign money now. You know, he's the one bankrolled by the Gulf states. And we've seen, you know, how influential, you know, I find it absurd and an indication of how screwed the whole world is and humanity, that someone like Elon Musk has been able to reach the position he has in the world. But he's got a cult following, right? These people are influential. And I think that's a problem for Trump. It is also a problem that they might just burn down the party in the next few months if they go head to head. I mean, it's so interesting seeing Trump having a go at DeSantis for saying he wants to cut Social Security, he wants to cut Medicaid. Well, this is the Democrats' line. This has been the Democrats' line for 20 years, right? So what is Trump going to do? Burn down conservatism just to win a nomination, right? There is that to me is the biggest positive for the Democrats out of this, that the other side appear to be ready to go to war with each other. And it might just save Biden, but stressful times, I think, for America and the world.
Yeah, pretty apocalyptic stuff from Paul there. Which yeah. William, I'm just considering, though, if Biden were to get if he were to get enough money, and if he were to oust Trump, and if he were to um, portray himself as somebody that the normal conservative, the guy who gets up early in the morning, to borrow Leo Varadkar's phrase, the person that the old conservative voter could vote for, how would you price him up against Biden?
That's a tricky one. I think that these things generally they tend to be pretty narrow, right? Presidential race tends to be pretty narrow. The biggest gap I can remember was between Trump and Clinton, and even then that was like quite wide for two major candidates. If that was to be the case, I would make Biden my marginal favorite. I'd probably have him at like 4 to 6-ish if that was the case. I think Paul makes a really good point before we move on. Actually, two things to note. Firstly, yes, the debt ceiling limit, that's massive, and so also is who gets blamed for it. We've had government shutdowns before. Not the stakes haven't been this high. They're really, really high. Paul writes brilliantly about this, so I direct you to him. But this is by far the biggest sort of crises we've approached. There's a lot of brinkmanship, especially on the GOP side. And should the worst happen, the fallout and who gets to blame for it will be crucial, absolutely crucial. It might even be worth waiting if you're not in this market already, just waiting to see what happens with that. Just quickly, also, a great point on having Musk on your team. I think that's very big, particularly in conservative circles as well, not to mention the amount of media he can get. And also, one thing with DeSantis, according to Morning Consult, 48% of Trump voters would have him a second choice. So he is definitely the catcher, right? He's there at first slip or in goal, whatever. He's ready to take it. So it will be something I'll never count him out of, even though I favour Trump at this moment. But really a watching brief to see how he lands.
I think it's a good market, the American presidential market, to look left field here to see that something might go wrong with the two major candidates. And I definitely think there could be value. I think the next president could be a big price. Maybe I'm wrong. Let's move on to Suella Braverman. This is just in recording this morning of Wednesday. The Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had been under pressure, Suella Braverman. Now, this is over the speeding investigation, but she's not going to get sacked, William, at least for the speeding investigation.
She won't get sacked for that. Understandable move, actually, which I know sounds crazy to be saying, but like it's 2023. This is in the 2010s, this is in the 2000s, when I think something like this would definitely have got you sacked within like 3 days or so. Different game now. The bigger trouble for Braverman, one of those is right, hopefully, is the news yesterday about her links with Rwanda. Long story short, got to credit Lizzie Deard of The Independent for breaking this. Great investigation. But Braverman had been apparently training Rwandan lawyers for a foundation. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. It was with Cherry Blair or whatever. But she didn't declare it when she became Home Secretary. She did this work for 10 years, and a number of the lawyers she trained are now senior members of the very same Rwandan government with whom the UK has a deal for the small
What
amount.
are you saying, Will? What are you saying?
Johnny, the guts of £140 million is a very small amount of money. And it only turns out that senior people in the Rwandan government may well have been trained by Braverman herself, which is, quite the coincidence. Before I quiet myself, to the relief of Star's legal team. But anyway, that's now very much, I think, the thing to focus on. Let's see how that goes. Let's see how that flies. We do have odds on when she'll go. We went up initially, actually. We went up slightly bigger yesterday that she would go 2024. We quickly got taken up at that price, but now we've swung to this year. She's 8-13 to go this year, 6-4 to go next year, 10-1 2025 or later. So we'll keep tracking that. It's an interesting market.
It's a fascinating market, and the whole Rwanda thing. I mean, you get the popcorn out here, Paul.
You would think so, and I would, look. I mean, I'd hasten to predict such a thing because the world's different now. But you would have thought that's the end of her, the Rwanda thing. I never thought the speeding fine would get her at all. I think that actually is kind of like the thing that they thrive off and say this is just the nonsense that the blob are trying to create to discredit her. But the Rwanda thing is bigger than that. The only thing I would say is that everything we've seen so far, from her being appointed in the first place, having previously had to resign just a few days earlier, suggests that Sunak can't do without her. I mean, it's the other big news of the day is this astonishingly hilarious story about Boris Johnson now being under police investigation because he got the Cabinet Office to he was getting the taxpayer to pay for his legal, and the Cabinet Office referred him. And you saw all those right-wing accounts come out last night, and they were all like, this is terrible. They're trying to destroy the right of the party. The blob are against us, and that the likes of Nadine Dorries and Jacob Rees-Mogg with their channels with their shows on GB News and everything, and all those Twitter accounts are going to defend Braverman to the hill, and they're going to try and destabilise Sunak. So I don't know whether he actually supports her, whether he actually agrees with her on any of this stuff. He might do, or else he wouldn't give her a job. But it seems more likely that he just is hostage to her.
Hostage to her, yeah. You'd be a braver man than me to call what she's actually called. But that is interesting, William, because obviously the right is backing Braverman. Sunak's in a slightly difficult position here. So how does he play it? I mean, he has shown himself to be relatively ruthless in his few months in charge.
I would disagree with that. I think Sunak hasn't been nearly as ruthless as he could have been. Braverman is a weak spot, a sort of terrible catch-22 again, because she is the representative of what I will call the ERG wing of the party. And if she goes, all hell breaks loose. But she's terrible with standards and conduct. So she stays, and it makes a mockery of his pledge to make the government and the Tory party sort of more accountable and a bastion of integrity. It's a really difficult one, and he's basically stuck between a rock and a hard place. Which way he goes in it, I don't know. I reckon he probably continues to grin and bear it. The idea being that a push against him, it would be less bearable than Braverman sort of chucking grenades inside the tent in the form of basically not adhering to any ministerial codes or any code of conduct whatsoever. But that said, there's enough pressure on her at the moment. I wouldn't be entirely comfortable, but I think at the moment she's staying for now.
Let's stay with the UK. The SNP is an absolute crisis, William, and the poll that you shared, I think the YouGov poll that you shared, incredible loss of voters, massive swing for Labour, pretty much as Paul predicted. But this is staggering from a position that we were in, under Nicola Sturgeon only a few months ago, to a position where Scottish independence itself now looks in serious jeopardy to me.
Yeah, I would agree. It's quite remarkable political breakup, come down, whatever you want to call it. The MRP, by the way, put together by a great team at YouGov, including friend of the polling station and previous Betty People interviewee Patrick English, shows Labour gaining 23 seats from the SNP, all from the SNP across the depth and breadth of Scotland. Absolutely remarkable numbers here. And of course, the key reason why the balance of power and also the task of Labour in terms of seats gained is different, I think, from what it was a year ago or a year or two ago. And for the last time, I promised to put this to bed afterwards, but please don't think of the local elections results from this year as the benchmark needed, because of things like this are happening. The same presumably in Wales. This firmly puts Labour very much closer to power whenever the next election is.
Yeah, so we don't currently have odds on Scottish referendum on the site, but just have a look. That will have been revised dramatically since earlier on this year. We do have those Braverman odds rather, as we say.
Wasn't the odds with a run? It was Scottish independence if there is a referendum.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was to reset at 2025. So if it hadn't been won by then we presumably just refresh the market.
Yeah.
I mean, I know we make this point quite a lot, but I really do think when they write the history books, etc., your Rawlings and your Frashers and your Steve Jones, etc., those types, Brexit will be seen as pushing back independence causes at least 5 to 10 years.
I still find that absolutely bizarre. Like,
No.
I know it just is. It seems completely counterintuitive, but I kind of know what you're saying as well. And that we will talk about Northern Ireland shortly, Paul. But this is actually in Northern Ireland. I do now believe this would be one of the reasons why United Ireland might not happen, because it's just easier to do it as it's gone along for the last few years.
Yeah, definitely. Brexit is a lesson to people. Like, this is a disaster. If you want to get involved in splitting a nation up, be prepared to lose the next 10 years to that division. And we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it. I mean, Northern Ireland's a different case altogether, because you've also got arguably now a better deal than anybody else. So why change it?
That's the thing. But okay, so where does the SNP go from here, from your perspective?
I think they go back to where they were, like before. I mean, okay, maybe independence is that much harder amongst younger people, so they sustain a position as a frontline party. But you have to put this down to Nicola Sturgeon. You have to say here that Nicola Sturgeon had a particularly amazing effect in that she was, the Queen of Scotland, so to speak. She was able to cross those political boundaries. But without her, they look like fundamentally just a pretty left-wing party, right? With a load of right-wingers in it who want to blow it up. Want to take it in another direction. They just look like another party, just like Labour or the Conservatives, and flawed.
Okay, we're going to finish up now on the province, as some people call it, the statelet, as some people call it, Northern Ireland, as others might call it. William, I'm of a nationalist persuasion. Very much want the United Ireland to happen. But it's strange when you see the seismic event of Sinn Féin becoming fairly comfortably the biggest party in Northern Ireland, albeit while the nationalist vote itself is sort of steady, possibly marginally rising, possibly slightly stagnating. You see, the unionist vote is actually falling. So the unionist vote is clearly falling. But the middle ground, which we see through Alliance is rising, is where we're at. And I think the thing that Paul referenced there is that if I were in Northern Ireland now, I felt initially Brexit would bring about United Ireland more likely than not. But now, as Paul referenced, the unique situation that Northern Ireland has, and the fact that we have a growing sort of middle ground, and even you have the Alliance Party itself saying it's not going to take a position on United Ireland, which is remarkable but kind of makes sense. What did you make of last week, William? And I did predict that Sinn Féin would kind of romp this, which it did. But that doesn't necessarily mean... It means that unionism is fractured, but I'm not really sure where nationalism is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main takeaway was that there appears to be now... and I think it's been really pronounced over the last 2 years. There appears to be a gradual shift in the direction of travel. That appears to me, as an outsider looking in, to be moving more towards nationalism and nationalist parties, rather than the other way around. And I think it's partly circumstance. I think it's also been pushed on by events that have happened here, namely especially Brexit. In the last few years or so. I think also there's a great deal, and this is just me sort of going off the hoof here, I think there's a great deal of growing resentment over the place that Northern Ireland has in Britain, in the sense that it's often used and ill-considered by the government. And I think a lot of people there aren't happy with the amount of attention or care that they're getting, because they don't have government. You haven't had Storm on. You've had lots of crises. The pandemic was a thing in Northern Ireland. Inflation is a big thing in Northern Ireland. There are lots of public services going to the wall in Northern Ireland, and they feel that, well, they don't have any representation. really, do they? And I think party that's been blamed for that, and I think correctly so, has been the DUP. So I think a number of factors have coalesced, basically, but it's really seriously historic because you've got a party now that has, the last 2 years, won undeniable sort of mandates, basically, for their vision and their position on the big issues of the day. And the direction of travel seems to be one way. You know, the DUP were happy to stay where they were, but Sinn Féin gained over 30 seats. And that's huge, absolutely huge. So I think it's a really big and really significant result. I wonder, I'm not sure about this because I hear different things from different sides of the Irish Sea. I wonder if this pushes forward the return of power sharing in Stormont. I wonder if this brings Stormont back a bit more quickly than might be the case.
I think it might bring about an actual change of the system whereby it's either one or the other, because it's not one or the other now. You have three minorities. You have the minority of unionism, the minority of nationalism, and the minority of the middle ground. And there's actually not much between the three of them. So you can't have one party like the DUP is hijacking Stormont in what in my view is a disgraceful way to stop general issues of local governance taking place. But who would have thought that in the 16th century, if one country just planted a shitload of people into another country and took the land of a load of locals, that it would cause all these problems years later? And here's the thing for you unionists: Britain does not give a shit about Northern Ireland. Problem is, though, you're actually not in a bad situation economically, because it's a lot cheaper to live there than the South. You now have access to the EU market as well as the UK market. And Paul, I don't even know where this is going anymore.
Well, I think Will made loads of good points there. I think, to me, the main sort of takeaway is that form of totally obstructionist unionism or loyalism, whatever, it's a dead end. It's not going to get anywhere. It's not going to solve any of the problems of Northern Ireland has.
It's a dead end, and people who are voting for it are dying as well.
Yeah, that's right. So you are in a situation where I do think it will speed up the return of Stormont. Again, I think a Labour government will also help in that regard. And I think that for unionism to persist as a phenomenon, it needs to kind of reinvent that kind of pragmatic unionism that you might associate with someone like David Trimble, for example, because that is the future. I don't think we're going to see United Ireland any more than we're going to see independent Scotland. I think it's all too difficult. It's all too difficult, too divisive, and as we were saying, I mean, look, Northern Ireland should really boom economically in the years ahead with its current arrangement with both the EU and the UK. It's hugely attractive to foreign investors for that reason. And I think that alone may, establish a new status quo, and, as I say, encourage a more moderate version of unionism, a more pragmatic and workable form of unionism.
Okay, I'm going to give William the last word to build up for next week. I think we're all completely screwed with climate change, so the border in Ireland is almost entirely irrelevant. But anyway, I wouldn't be quite as bleak as Paul on it. Although it was absolutely stark when I went to Downpatrick for the races on Friday, because I am one of these anomalous Southerners that actually does spend some time in the north. Bloody hell, the price of everything. It was like East to West Germany. It was like a completely different country in terms of the cost of everything. And yes, I did buy a load of razor blades. William, last word to you.
Important to recognise also demographics here. I think the census has shown that there are more Catholics than Protestants, correct me if I'm wrong, for the first time in Northern Ireland. And Sam McBride wrote a piece for the Belfast Telegraph on this. He got in trouble for the introduction, but the general gist was that this change, it might be a bit generational. It might be something that we're seeing in other countries here. We are sort of seeing it in predictive patterns, I should add, with Brexit. I know that the polling's now changed on it, right? But a couple of years ago, the argument when Brexit will be reversed by generations in the future, because it's a more sort of liberal thing to be more pro-EU, and to be anti-EU is a more conservative thing. And as the balance of time goes on, more younger votes will come in and that will be changed. And you sort of get a mirror argument here with Catholics and people who identify more as Irish or Northern Irish, but not British. And it'll be interesting to see if that continues on. One thing I do think is eminently clear is that if the DUP can't get something going in terms of governance soon, they're going to be in a lot of trouble. They're already in a lot of trouble. They're paying a really heavy price for it. But I think it's like a necessity for them in the next few months or so to get that going. Otherwise, it's a complete dead end for them, in the sense that nobody's particularly happy with them. The UK wants them to get back into Stormont power, into Stormont. The US definitely does. Everybody in Northern Ireland wants it. So something's got to crack. Who will crack first and realize what needs to be done? That is the big question.
Can I just say,
go ahead, Paul.
Sorry, I just want to make my point. I mean, it's not predicting anything, but it's really more my personal opinion. But I just think as time goes on, are we not going to move beyond nationalism, right? The world as we know it is not really made up of nations. It's made up of various financial interests. You know, the real interest for the people of Ireland or the UK or any of the nations within it is to be able to access the global economy, to have foreign investment. The power brokers in the world are not nations anymore. They're groups of interests that ally together, whether that's on a political level like the EU or just a financial level like some of these donor things that I talk about a lot with the Gulf states and Russia, etc. Right? That's the world. And I just wonder, like, you know, the whole point is we've spent the last 10 years talking about nationalism on these islands. And look where it's got us. Look at the situation. Right, the problems we have in this country need to be practically dealt with, and I think there is a market for that. I think Keir Starmer is beginning to lay that out, and I think that, you know, if Sinn Féin win in the south, as I think that's highly likely, you know, they'll no longer be an opposition party. They'll have to govern, and they'll be confronted by these problems. And I wonder whether their particular desire to go for, you know, a divisive referendum will fall away. That's just how that would be my personal view. Whether it turns out like that is another matter.
Well, okay, so yeah, I think that's quite profound what you're saying there, and I think the Sinn Féin coming into power in the south, which is, I'm not sure if it's long odds on, but it's certainly odds on. They're definitely going to top the poll in the next election. Is going to be fascinating because they've basically become a populist party. They've abandoned their hard left philosophies in order to get popularity. But this will confront them when they see the housing crisis and see all the issues that the South has, which are first world issues. But it'll be fascinating. You mentioned Sam McBride, William, as well. His book Burned, which is on the renewable ash fiasco. It sounds one of the most boring things I ever tried about renewable energy in Northern Ireland. Sounds absolutely, you know, I wouldn't even read this on holiday. It's a phenomenal book, and no other book, in my view, essentially sums up how much of a screwed up place Northern Ireland is right now, and will be going forward. On that lively note, thanks to Paul and William. We've gotten through a lot today. The SNP is screwed. Looks like Irish nationalists, despite Sinn Féin's great rise, could be sort of screwed as well. We're all screwed, and we're all screwed. We'll see you next week.
But in the end, only one can be crowned, with name engraved to become renowned. All that remains is for that one to be found.
Who will win? Away they go!